Last time we started talking about personality and how to measure it, how to understand it, and we talked about a couple of different theories, and each theory had kind of a main point of view. You know, the psychodynamic or the psychoanalytics was really focusing on the unconscious motivations, the battle of the id, the ego, and how the superego kind of mediates all that stuff. Conceptual and trait theory really focused on measurable dimensions and those different aspects of the personality that could be correlated or connected to different forms of performance. The humanistic view, or the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the whole notion of self-actualization really talks about, it really plays to this notion of the internal capacity for the individual to grow, and that to truly grow, you have to get to a point where you're going to give of yourself, and that's ultimately how you fulfill the most almost kind of important need of the individual. And then finally we had the socio-cognitive, or the social learning, and that was Skinner and Bandura, and this whole idea of role modeling imitation, and really a great example of interaction, the interactionism paradigm, and how, you know, even something as simple as who we are at our core is really, it kind of works in coordination with the environment around us. And so we kind of use that as a starting point again, and a bit of a review as we start moving forward. And when you really want to get to how you manifest and really identify and see and start diving into the personality, this notion of affective states becomes very important, because that's just an idea that talks about how people, individuals, organisms, whatever you want, how we react to different things. And again, this is a byproduct of that interactionism paradigm, and you can really get a sense for someone in terms of how they react to good behavior, bad behavior, tragedy, those types of things. And so all of this, a nice way of bridging this discussion of the personality and then eventually performance, and how to take all this stuff and kind of mold it and fold it into different leadership strategies, is through this affective states, and really starting to see how moods and emotions and all those things kind of work together. A great example of an affective state, or the interplay of moods and emotions. It's a good example, but it's absolutely horrific. But when you have a devastating injury, maybe on a playing field, if you want to go to a horrific broken leg in basketball, or even in your sport organizations, you have someone that's diagnosed with a form of cancer or something like that, and people are going to act and react to those things differently, and that's how the personality is going to interact with the stimulus or the stimuli of something they're very good or something very bad. Does that person get very high? Do they get very low? And all those different types of things. Well, so the mood is situation specific, and it tends to change quite a bit, and it's basically a psychological response to something that is occurring in your environment. Okay? And so that could be anything. If we're talking about athletic performance, then we're talking about how you feel. Oftentimes, as an elite athlete, you need to have confidence in your equipment. So think of a professional basketball player and not liking the surface of the basketball, or not liking how their shoes are cutting and gripping on the floor, and so they go and they try to wipe them off, those types of things. All right, all those little responses, actions, and interactions can actually impact the mood. It can make you feel good about yourself. Maybe you feel insecure about yourself. So all these things, if you start looking at what you've done in the past, or how your equipment, for example, has worked in the past, either in a positive or negative way, these things are going to be associated with your performance in the past, but also presently, and then how the individual perceives their future performance. All this is based on the idea of the environment. All right. So we have moods. Well, it behooves us to then start to try to narrow that down, funnel it down, to say, well, I'm in a mood. I'm in a bad mood. I'm in a good mood. What does that mean? Let's try to funnel it down and be much more specific. And so the profile of mood states, the POMS, your POMS score, is actually one way athletically that you're able to do that. Now, I want you to look at this, and intuitively people all know what confusion, fatigue, anger, depression, tension, what all those moods are, and how, in this particular example, how we exhibit those things. But if you notice in the profile of mood states, there's really only one positive mood, and that becomes very important. Because as a leader, as someone who's trying to affect or impact in a positive way the psychological state or the mood of an individual, you have to realize that, the deck is stacked against you to some extent. And people have a predilection because of, it's easier to fall into a bad mood than it is to get into a good mood. And so taking this POMS score one step further and trying to chart it out and really identify how to take a healthy person, a healthy athlete, and what is their mood supposed to look like? If you were to graph this, what are you shooting for? What's the goal with regards to the perfect profile of calmness, excitement, that type of thing, as it's associated with performance? And this is what it looks like. Now, keeping in mind, if we're talking about an unsuccessful athlete or an elite athlete, you can actually apply this to exercise psychology as well. And essentially what you have is down here, you have all the different profile of mood states. Okay, there's vigor, the only positive one. All right, and the elite athlete exhibits what they call this iceberg profile. In that confusion and fatigue is very low. Vigor is at its highest point. These are your scores over here. All right, anger, pretty low. Depression and tension. So the three negative moods over here are relatively low. The two negative moods over here are relatively low. You're going to spike with vigor. You feel good about yourself. It doesn't mean that it's easy, but you feel confident, vigorous, you're full of life, excited. And what you see here for the unsuccessful athlete, these scores tend to be there's much more of a plateau effect. So the iceberg profile, what you're shooting for is very, very high, vigorous scores. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? Oh, it's so great. All we have to do is keep the tension and depression, anxiety low, and keep the vigor high. But keep in mind, we're dealing with different group dynamics on a team. We're also dealing with very, very different personalities. And you don't have like a uniform recipe of how to deal with different personalities on different teams amongst different sports. We know that that's kind of what you're shooting for, but how you go about doing that is going to be very, very different. It's going to be unique to your organization, your team. And so you hear coaches do this a lot, right? Is they have to maybe have an off season or a preseason or something. They have to get to know their team, and it's almost become cliched. In the sport business world, as in the business world, we've really fallen back onto these team building exercises as a way of getting to know the people that you're working with, or having what they call a retreat. So the idea is that maybe you go tour a facility that's something similar to the facility that you and your team works within, or maybe you go to, they have all these different team building exercises and obstacle courses up around Kansas City. That's where I did one of those. It was the team building exercise. You have the different ropes courses, and you had to climb these walls as a team and that type of thing. And the whole notion there is, how do you act and interact with different personalities? So if you're dealing with a youth soccer team that's comprised of 8 to 9-year-old girls in the local Wichita area, the characteristics of that team are going to be very, very, very important for influencing not just performance, but also an understanding of how that profile of mood states relates to whatever identified outcome you have for your team. And part of that, and we'll talk about goal setting later down in the semester, but if your coach or coaches have different goals and then players have different goals, not everyone's on the same page. And so even the team building strategies of trying to maximize the performance and that type of thing, they may not be on the same page. Even the measurement of performance, there's the old cliche that progress does not equal success. Okay, you're getting better, but you're not necessarily being successful with regards to whatever that terminal or end goal is, if the end goal is to, for example, win a conference championship. So again, there's a lot of mitigating factors when you're thinking about this. One of the things, arguably one of the most crippling things for looking at the relationship and kind of retarding the relationship of the profile of mood states and performance is the whole notion of depression. Now, Depression is one of those things that it's a mood that tends to, and we're not talking about the clinical depression, although, and we'll talk about that later in the semester, but you can have mood-based depression. And mood-based depression tends to be an antecedent for a lot of the other things, such as fatigue and anger, being short with your teammates, feeling very tense, and if you tense up, then the information processing applications of the brain tends to slow down. Okay, now what we see is that those people that don't have depression, all those things, anger and tension and confusion, the ability to think through things, these tend to be decreased or retarded a little bit. And vigor, that thing that we want, tends to be at its highest. Now all that is disturbingly commonsensical. We know that. All right. It's important to talk about because sometimes people just see that iceberg profile and they say, oh, there it is. That's what we need to do. And what I'm trying to get here is that, moods, whatever, if you have your different profile of mood states, all right, those things are going to interact with the personality of the individual. Now, the personality of the individual, personality of the coach or the leader, and both of those things together are going to influence how we process both positive and negative emotions. And that's what we're trying to get at here, is that moods and emotions can be extremely impactful in a positive and a negative way. They can be debilitating, and they can make you feel like you're on top of the world, and your productivity and efficiency can actually increase. So how do we go through and do all that stuff? That's kind of what we're trying to do. Now, the Gardner Group, which we've talked about before, is a consulting firm that does a lot of work with private business, but also increasingly is starting to have an impact on institutions of higher education. Of course, here at Wichita State, they've been brought in, and they have this very, very basic philosophy: know, do, reflect. Okay? What we're talking about here is the knowing part. Right? We have to know in terms of trying to manage people, and that's what management and leadership really is about: managing people's emotions and their productivity and trying to bring those things together. Before we can do that, and that's the doing, we have to know how the individual works, how they process information, how the environment is going to influence them. Once we're able to do that, then we can reflect back on our strategies and really get a sense for who we are, what we're doing, and where our organization is going.